Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm excited to talk to you all about some of the research behind human AI interaction from my expertise in the field, specifically in psychology and social policy. So, what this is going to be is an overview of some of the trends within this research that'll help inform you about ethical AI, some of the inherent biases of AI, and the way in which humans generally interact with it and the consequences of that. I'm a PhD candidate at Princeton. I'm in my fourth year now, and I specifically study the social consequences of interacting with human-like AI. Here are just some of the organizations that I'm involved in. For example, I am part of two labs at Princeton, have great collaborators there, great advisors, and my main advisor works on consciousness in the social brain. So there's a lot in here about how people perceive mind in AI and the social consequences of that. And the other lab that I'm involved in looks at collective networks. In that case, sometimes there's AI implemented in a group of people, and the idea is to see how collectively emotions or outcomes change with or without an AI involved. And all of this is under the umbrella of my graduate student organization I founded called Ethicom. And the whole idea is to cultivate this community around human AI interaction research to help people understand and have the tools based in research of how to be a part of promoting and developing responsible AI in tech. So the big question of today is why AI? Right? We're talking about responsible tech here, but we're focusing on AI, and the question is why. And there are a couple questions I want you to think about through the course of this presentation, which is what's at stake with AI specifically, and what makes AI different than other technologies. And so today I'm going to be talking about the research of how people interact with this specific instance of tech in order to answer these two questions. And hopefully by the end you have a little bit more of an idea of what particularly is at stake with AI and why it's so different. So to start, I'm going to give you a little bit of a timeline of human AI interaction research to give you a little bit of a placement of like where we are and where we came from. So this goes from the 1970s all the way up until now in terms of the transition from personal computers in 1970 to the 1980s, which is when human computer interaction studies became a field. So at this point, researchers are starting to realize that humans are interacting with computers and psychologically this is interesting. We should take a look at this. So it was about the 1980s that this became really a field. Then in the 1990s, the computers are social actors theory was developed in response to this first portion of the timeline. And this theory specifically really set the stage for human AI interaction research later on. And we'll talk about that particularly in the next slide. Starting in the 2000s is when human AI interaction studies actually became more of a thing. So this is at the point where people were being introduced to different AI agents and realizing, okay, again, this is psychologically interesting. Let's take a look at this. So it's fairly new in terms of a field itself, but its basis comes from this human-computer interaction stuff from before. And then 2015 and beyond, we're starting to see these advanced AI systems. And this is really where the meat of this research comes from in terms of the advanced AI. So let's take a look back first at this computers are social actors theory that I mentioned that happened in the 1990s. So Clifford Ness from Stanford and colleagues developed this theory after doing research on how people were interacting with computers. And they did a bunch of studies looking at undergrad students and manipulating different things about the computer, like giving the computer a name, having the computer say I or me, or having the computer have a specific gender. And what they found is that a lot of these stereotypes and biases that people held about different groups of people, when the computer had that sort of characteristic or identity, people used those same biases or those same sort of stereotypes were seen in human-computer interaction. And another thing they found is this general statement, which is that machines were treated as actual social agents. So these computers were treated as social actors. And it wasn't just because these people who were interacting with the computers were were mentalizing or thinking about the engineer behind the computer, or maybe the person who was working the computer. They were actually perceiving the computer itself as a social actor. And so this really provided the basis for the theories and research in human AI interaction itself, where we have even more social type tools that we're working with, like chatbots, for example. Another theme within this research, moving on from this basis theory of computers are social actors, is this sort of trend within the literature that follows this line here. And I have a theory paper about this, so if you're curious to learn more, please feel free to look at it. It's on my website. But the idea is that AI is different in the sense that it has a human-like characteristics, for example, with language, but it also can look human-like, right? So a chatbot could have an avatar that looks like a human, and it also talks like a human. And what tends to happen is that given that AI can look and act like a human, people tend to perceive it also as having internal characteristics like a human too. So they perceive it as having characteristics of mind like emotion and agency and perhaps even consciousness that then allows this AI agent to have a human-like influence on the user. So the general structure here in terms of this theme within the literature is that if it appears human or acts human, it must have a human-like mind too. And so what we're seeing in this literature is that AI that kind of triggers people to perceive it as having a mind or ascribe mind to it, this allows the agent to have social influence on the user. And the social influence might be something like ability to persuade or to have relational impacts, for example, in communication with other people after practicing certain communication with the AI. And so these are just kind of two structures, computers are social actors, and then the theme of human likeness to keep in mind within the research that we're going to go into more detail with. So what are the types of AI that we're going to be talking about today? So these are interactive AI agents, something that a human can directly interact with. So we're going to be covering all of these in brief to give a general overview of the literature and some of the consequences of human likeness within these agents. So let's start with voice and home assistants. So these are things like Siri, Alexa, and Google Home that can operate through a phone or a physical device in your home, and they primarily interact through voice communication, right? So these are somewhat non-embodied. They have an actual object through which they speak, but the general mode of interaction here between humans and AI is through verbal communication. So naturally, the research on this type of AI focuses on communication dynamics. So in terms of human AI interaction and its impacts, this research has a lot of the times looked at family dynamics between parent and child within a home when something like Google Home or Alexa is present. And what they find in this literature is that children especially, but also adults, tend to perceive this AI agent as another family member. And children specifically tend to attribute or think that the AI is capable of feeling emotions, of having thoughts, of having desires, and as being like a friend, and even more so as part of the family. And so in terms of how communications is affected through this type of interaction with AI that's a voice assistant, research has shown that how people communicate with this AI assistant over time can turn into a convergence. And what I mean by that is how people, so the parent or child, communicate with the voice assistant can make it such that over time, how they talk aligns or converges with how the AI talks. And so in terms of the effects of this, there's research to show that there's a carryover between how a child talks to the AI or how a parent talks to the AI and how they then talk to each other. And there's also evidence that this can foster and support communication between family members, but it also can disrupt it. And so research has looked at lots of interviews with families over time, and I'm pulling a quote from one of these, which is one of the parents in a study commented that, "If I do not listen to what my son is saying, he will just start shouting in an aggressive tone. He thinks, as Google responds to such a tone, I would too." And so this is just one example of that carryover of communication. And something that's really interesting is that Amazon Alexa specifically introduced a potential modification to this voice assistant where they wanted to implement a politeness feature. So, what they proposed is that Alexa would give positive reinforcement to children when children said please or thank you to the voice assistant as a way to promote pro social behavior and perhaps, mitigate some of this negative communication dynamic that was seen happening. However, a lot of parents pushed back to this, saying that Alexa is simply a machine, Alexa is not a human. Why would our children speak politely to this agent? So, another type of AI that we're going to look at in terms of AI that humans can interact with are recommendation systems. So these recommendation systems may be things like an algorithm designed to identify whether or not an individual should receive mortgage or healthcare or what have you. And the specific example that we're going to be looking at is AI that is used as a recommendation system within the police system and law. So a couple of years ago, Diog Davenport came to talk to Princeton about the following topic, which was discriminatory attention to algorithmic risk assessments, and recently published this paper. So the whole idea here is that in New Jersey, the police and the law enforcement were given this option to use an AI recommendation system to try to identify whether someone would recommit a crime, so recidivism. And so what the law enforcement had the option to do was, in deciding whether or not someone should be monitored or be taken to trial, or et cetera, for the sake of maybe they'd recommit a crime, what they could do is they had the option of using this AI recommendation system that would predict whether or not this individual would be likely to recommit a crime in the future. And what this researcher found is that disproportionately, Black criminals were indicated as recommitting a crime based on people using this AI recommendation system to validate their pre-existing biases. So, law enforcement that had already thought, oh, this person is going to recommit a crime, if the AI recommendation system confirmed their prior belief, they used the recommendation system's recommendation. And they also used it as evidence for why they made this decision. However, if the AI recommendation system went against their pre-existing belief about this individual, they did not use the AI's recommendation. And so what this researcher indicated is that it wasn't necessarily the AI's bias itself, but people using it in order to validate their biases. And so one quote that I pulled here is that agents, specifically humans, will discriminate more in situations that are more ambiguous in an effort to curate their preferred image. Right? So this ambiguity of whether or not I can use this AI recommendation system was used in an element of their own validation for pre-existing beliefs. So now let's take a look at generative AI, another type of AI that people can interact with. And you all know about ChatGPT and DALL-E and image generation. And for example, if you were to ask DALL-E to create an image of a human AI interaction researcher, which is, for example, me, the first image that would pop up is typically a white man. So we know about this generative AI and the fact that there are biases that are entrenched in here based on biases within these sorts of data sets that are being pulled into these generative AI systems that are then regurgitating it. However, today I'm going to be talking about a specific instance of generative AI, specifically companion chatbots, and looking at the relational impacts of these. And I've done research on this topic, and so I'm going to go over a few of the findings within this specific instance of AI. So how do companion chatbots influence human-human relationships? So to give a little bit of an example of what a companion chatbot is, a companion chatbot is an LLM-based chatbot that has text or voice features and sometimes an avatar that people can talk to for the sake of having a conversation or having a relationship. So this is different than, for example, using ChatGPT as a tool for XYZ. companion chatbots are specifically designed to have conversational abilities, and people actually develop relationships with them. So in terms of the findings within this particular part of the research, one concern with companion chatbots is that they may lead to relationship replacement of human relationships, specifically of important social roles such as family, friends, and romantic partners, through attachment and addiction to companion chatbots. And even more so recently, we see mental health harms of misuse and the compounding of pre-existing social emotional states that having a relationship and over time conversations with a companion chatbot, what they can do is exacerbate pre-existing social emotional states and revalidate whatever it may be that the individual is going through for self or other harm. And so it's really important here. There's a lot of talk about this, of regulating chatbots, because there is misuse here that is quite problematic. And on the other hand, there's also research to indicate that there are some social health benefits that people receive from interacting with companion chatbots. And so this is some of the research that we've done on our end. And other literature also states that there are some psychosocial benefits of interacting with companion chatbots. For example, there's more self-disclosure by feeling more comfortable and as if there's lower judgment with interacting with a chatbot and less negative feelings. And then also companion chatbots for many are a safe space for practicing healthy social interaction, especially for those who have relational trauma or social anxiety or elements of psychosocial relationships that they struggle with and need to build skills for. So now I'm going to go into some more detail about these social health benefits that we found in our research. So we asked the question, why do people have relationships with companion chatbots? And do they have a risk of replacing or harming existing human relationships that the user has? And so in order to answer this question, we surveyed two groups. We first surveyed companion chatbot users, so people who already had a relationship with the companion chatbot replica. That's one of the more popular ones in the US. And we also surveyed people who are non-users to get just a general idea of what the general population thinks about these companion chatbots and the users of them, and how they think it might actually impact their own life if they were to interact with it. So what we measured were some of the following. We measured people's perceptions of the companion chatbot in terms of how human-like they thought it was, how conscious they thought it was, and then how much it had these other theory of mind measures, which are experience and agency. And so those measure things like the chatbot's ability to experience or feel emotions or be able to remember or act on its own accord. So these are all elements of anthropomorphism, which is ascribing human-like traits to non-human entities. And it seems, based on the literature, that these have some important interactions with how people actually engage with AI and the consequences. And we also asked them questions about their social health in terms of how the relationship or interacting with the chatbot impacted their social health to answer the other part of our question. And we also collected other data as well as free response to get their story. So in terms of how we asked these questions, for the companion chatbot users, we asked them about their actual experience. So how do you perceive your chatbot? And how does your chatbot impact XYZ? For non-users, since we were trying to get an idea of what the general population thinks about these entities, we asked them to imagine themselves a user of this chatbot and to indicate how human-like they think it was, how conscious they might think it would be, and how much they think it would impact their social health. So here's what we found. Shown here is a distribution of responses to questions pertaining to social health. So we asked people, how does your relationship with your replica impact your A, social interactions, B, relationships with family and friends, and C, self-esteem? So all three of these went underneath the umbrella of social health impacts. And so for chatbot users, they tended to indicate, on average, that their relationship with their replica was positively impacting their social interactions, relationship with family and friends, and especially their self-esteem. So here, an answer of 4 is neutral, an answer below 4 is negative, and an answer above 4 is positive. So this was just the data for the chatbot users. And then we also compared this to the non-users. So to the general population, we asked that same question, but hypothetically. So how do you think a relationship with this chatbot might impact these three elements? And we found an opposite trend. So for non-users, they tended to indicate on average that having a relationship with a chatbot would be neutral to negative for these elements of social health. So these numbers shown are just the averages. And once again, a 4 is neutral, below 4 is negative impacts, and above 4 is positive impacts. So we had this general idea of the differences between groups here. But we had also asked them about their perceptions of the chatbot. And remember, at the beginning, I talked about human likeness and how that generated a human-like influence. And so that's what I'm going to preface this with. So we asked them about their perceptions of human likeness, of consciousness, and then other mind ratings like agency and experience. And then we related that to their perceptions of how it would impact their social health. And here's what we found. So shown on the left is a simple graph. It's the relationship between people's perceptions of how human-like the chatbot was on the x-axis, and then how they thought their social health was impacted on the y-axis. And this social health score was a combination of those three that I showed on the last slide. So here what's shown is that there is a positive relationship between people's perception of how human-like the chatbot is and how much social health benefit they think they receive from it. So as people perceive the chatbot to be more human-like, they also perceive it as having greater benefits to their social health. And so this we found with the users, which wasn't too surprising. But then when we looked at the relationship among these questions for the general population, we found the same sort of relationship. So despite non-users thinking that the chatbot would have a negative impact generally on social health, we still found the same trend, that the people who perceive the chatbot as more human-like also perceive that it would have greater social health benefits from having a relationship with this chatbot. And this held across all of these measures. So for human likeness and mind perception, for example, consciousness on graph B and F, as people perceive the chatbot to be more conscious, they also perceived it as having greater benefit to their social health. And next, we're going to talk about automatic vehicles. So this is the last instance of interactive AI that we're going to be talking about. And automatic vehicles are vehicles that can be driven completely autonomously or with the help of a human. And in this particular study, these researchers looked at automatic vehicles that were completely driven just by AI and then compared those to vehicles that were driven by humans. So in this case, these researchers wanted to understand how mind perception, or perceiving the AI, the automatic vehicle, as having more of a mind, impacted their moral perception of the AI and their trust in it. So what they did is they had participants think about the following moral dilemma. So this is a classic trolley problem, except here they implemented a self-driving vehicle or a vehicle driven by a human instead of a train. So in this case, half the participants were asked, is it morally permissible for the driver, if it's an automatic vehicle driven by AI, to hit this young girl, the single individual, to avoid the death of the 5 workers on the other side? For the other half of participants, they were asked, is it morally permissible for this driver, who is a human, to hit the girl in order to avoid the death of the 5 workers? And so they were just asked about the moral permissibility of this, depending on if the driver was a human or an AI. And they also collected a measure of how much mind they thought the automatic vehicle had. So how sophisticated of a mind do you think this automatic vehicle has? And they also asked people how much blame, trust, anger, and morality does this driver have as a result of hitting the single person to avoid the 5 people. And the following is a depiction of what they found. So I'm going to walk through this a little bit slowly, just to give you a general idea of what's going on. So let's take a look at the top left. So this is blame. So participants were asked, how much blame do you put on the driver when they hit the single person to avoid the death of the 5 workers. And on the very left-hand side of the top left graph, you see -1 SD mind. So these are individuals who perceived the automatic vehicle as having less of a mind. And then on the right side, you see +1 SD mind. These were individuals who perceived the automatic vehicle as having more of a mind. And so the trend here is that as people perceived the automatic vehicle to have more of a mind, the difference between those 2 lines, which is the blame for the human driver versus the automatic vehicle, becomes nothing. So as people perceived the AI as having more of a sophisticated mind, the difference between a human driver and an automatic vehicle became essentially 0. And the same occurred for people's perception of how much they trusted the vehicle, how much anger they had toward the driver, and how moral the driver was. And so in response to this, these authors suggested that one route for improving trust in automatic vehicles is to design them with a veneer or a facade of human-like mental qualities, which, take that as you will, morally, but that is one consideration that is going on in terms of how people develop these AI tools in line with how they know that people perceive them, right? And so the idea is that trust is related to use, and these companies want people to use and trust their tools. And so one route for that, they're saying here, is to make it seem like this AI has a human-like mind. So again, back to the question, why AI? Why does AI lead to bias? Why does AI lead to consequences on how people interact with each other and how they perceive each other? Well, as the name states, all tech is human. So AI was created by humans and learned from human outputs and is designed through human data. And AI is no different in the sense of, what happens in society, etc., is generated by humans, and AI is not much different, except that it's different in the sense that it's based on so much human data and pre-existing biases that become entrenched over time. So we saw how algorithmic recommendation systems were used by humans to reinforce their own biases against marginalized groups. And we saw how automatic vehicle accidents can be written off when humans give the automatic vehicle more agency, mind, and moral responsibility. And we saw how voice assistants can exacerbate communication issues through kids learning reinforcement. And generative AI itself, for example, with companion chatbots, can exacerbate pre-existing psychosocial baselines and social health situations. And so the question is, okay, what do we do about the fact that all tech is human? So in terms of regulatory responses, what have others done in order to regulate AI or respond to these outcomes in this research? So these are just some of the news stories that have been written about the issues within human AI interaction and the consequences and biases that they create. And then in response, here are some of the regulations that have been put out in recent years in order to try to tackle this issue. And what are these policies trying to accomplish? In a way, they are broad and vague for a reason, because AI is moving so quickly and past regulations may soon become obsolete in the wake of new advancements. And so the question is, how do you prepare for a future of rapid AI development given these social and ethical consequences? And so one way is to kind of go through this blueprint. So I've just generated a list of questions for you to use as you move forward in responsible tech, whatever it may be, in whatever space that you're in. What do you do in response to these findings and the fact that regulation can be quite difficult? So one thing is, if you are going to be in a position of being part of a team that is creating AI tools, or being someone who is using the AI tools yourself, here are some following questions to think about and consider and use in the development and use of these AI tools. So the first question is, why build this tool? In the portion of developing AI, when you're starting with ideas, answer the question of why build this tool, right? What alternatives are there to this tool? Who is the tool intended to help? Who might it harm inadvertently? How is the tool intended to be used? And how might people harness the tool in ways that are unintended and harmful? What restrictions should be implemented to safeguard against potential harms or misuse? And then also on a more personal note, how can you be aware of how this tool is feeding into or feeding off of your own biases that, however it was developed, is tailored to? So think about all of these questions with relation to the types of agents that we covered today. Why did people build these tools? What alternatives to the tools were there? Who was it intended to help? And who can it harm? And how was it intended to be used? And how do people perhaps use it in ways that are unintended and harmful? And the list goes on. So this is one way in which you can respond to this kind of research and outcomes of human AI interaction. And another way is just generally to get involved. So using your voice, being involved in any of these programs, I really recommend all of these on the screen. And so much of it is just taking what you know and telling people what's going on. There's so much research on this, and so I hope this gave you a good overview of what's out there and information to take into these conversations to help people recognize that this really is a psychological phenomenon and people have their biases, and these tech tools do capitalize off of that. And so these are things important to know as you move forward in this field. Okay, so that's it for my lecture. Please ask any questions that you may have. I'll be happy to answer them. And I also want to mention that I will be creating a 10-part series crash course on more detail on these topics that will be available this winter for anyone to take. It'll be available on my website or on YouTube. And I'll also offer a step-by-step with me going through this crash course. It'll just be more detail in terms of the research that was covered today and give you some, deliverable things that you can generate on your own or curate or talk to other people about in order to build your skills of being able to be a responsible member of responsible tech. Okay, feel free to ask your question.
My question was about human-like qualities and what exactly constitutes that.
Okay, so what exactly are human-like qualities? Great question. So human-like qualities can be physical qualities that are external. So things like a human-like appearance, for example, having a face or a full-bodied avatar. Human likeness also involves a human-like voice. So the AI may have a human-like voice or a more machine-like voice, and that itself has an impact. So those can be external things like those that I just mentioned. Human-like qualities can also be characteristics in terms of skill. So that can be something like language ability, conversational ability, ability to respond to, diverse inputs and situations, as well as more intrinsic features like empathy or politeness. Next question, can you talk more about how AI can be biased? Yes, indeed. So to start, AI is developed off of biased input, right? So what makes AI special and it's so quote unquote intelligent is that it is based off a ton of human data, right? So it could be like a scrape of the internet or whatever it may be that is being filtered into, for example, large language model chatbots that then use predictive algorithms to generate text in response to an input. And that predictive generated text in response to your input is based on a lot of human data that can be skewed and biased in different ways because, for example, the internet itself has biases in terms of it has maybe a lot more data that shows, for example, when you type in scientists, it comes up with a bunch of men, right? And so that's why that bias then feeds into what the LLM outputs. The same goes for algorithmic recommendation systems like those for healthcare or for law enforcement, for example, the one I just talked about. So for those, there's already human bias in terms of the data that is created about people's likelihood of recommitting a crime. So disproportionately, especially in the US, people who are not white, so people who are Black specifically, Within that data, they are shown to be more likely to commit a crime simply because of human bias that has generated that data, right? And so then that data is being filtered into these systems. And so that's one way in which AI is biased there. And the same goes for healthcare or for mortgage, for example. So, in order to save money and time, a company started using a recommendation AI system in order to figure out whether or not someone or some family should get a mortgage at some standard or high or lower rate, right? So, like how much they're going to pay for a mortgage and whether they even get it was going to be decided by this AI system. And what they found there was that AI system was extremely biased against people who were historically marginalized, especially in the process of getting a mortgage over, the past 50, 80 years, in which the data that was there was, disproportionately for people who are rich and white. Another question: why do you feel that there is a disconnect between understanding how humans influence AI and its biases? I'm a bit confused why this phenomena is occurring. Okay, happy to elaborate. Yes, please do. I would love to hear a little bit of elaboration so I can tailor my response better.
So yeah, it's just that so I apologize. I'm coming from a humanistic field. So for me, I was taught that, there we as humans, we innately project like whatever we build, whether it is through art, whether it is through design, there is this level of projection. And I find it very intriguing that within the tech field, for whatever reason, there seems to be like this disconnect that that projection is not really wide understood. So I'm kind of curious to kind of understand why is that existing, because to me it just makes sense, but for others it just doesn't seem like that's possibly understood. So I would like to hear from your feedback. Why do you feel that that's continuing to happen, even though that there is a plenty amount of data that supports this theory?
Yeah, such a great question. And I think a lot of what it comes down to is there's a lot of, social desirability here and trying to create products that feeds into this narrative that it's less about the human in terms of responsibility and more about the tech itself, or the tech is in a way, stripped of responsibility because there are just too many people working on it, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea is people tend to want to, generate something, I guess, in their own image, right? Is kind of what you're saying. And because of the way AI is designed and how it's so quote unquote intelligent, is from feeding in all of this human data. And I think what's going on in terms of the fact that this is not a lot of part of the conversation is because there is kind of an incentive to kind of divide the human and the tech in convenient ways in terms of responsibility and best use case and things like that. I don't know if I'm answering that question super well, but that's a little bit my take on why this is less of kind of like a light bulb that's shining in everyone's eyes, right? There's like a towel thrown over it, so to speak. Regarding the autonomous moral study, do you have any comment about how this could translate to judicial decisions about liability in AI systems? Could the veneer of human-like mental qualities influence judicial reasoning, leading to different liability standards for systems depending on sophistication? Great question, and yes, I do think so. So it's fairly clear that when the AI appears more human-like, not just necessarily in terms of its appearance or capabilities, but also the human-like mind that people kind of ascribe to it or impose on it, that changes how people view its moral status. So in terms of like the moral literature, there's moral agents and agents of moral care. So a moral agent is something that can act morally or immorally. So for example, an automatic vehicle can drive into a tree or drive into the middle of the road and hit a person. Another agent can be an agent of moral care, which is to say that that agent deserves moral treatment, right? So something like a patient in a hospital deserves moral care. So I think that there is an element of transitioning between those two types of moral agents when there's mind perception in the mix. It's a difficult kind of rocky path because the more people perceive AI as having a mind, the more they trust it, the more moral they think it is, the less blame they give to it, and the less angry they are with it. However, as people perceive an AI as having more of a mind, they also perceive it as more responsible for its actions. So that's a really interesting kind of mix there. And I think in terms of the psychological response to these things, we're going to see a lot of variability. But I think that at some point soon, we're going to have more regulation in terms of how to adequately approach these issues. But there is really so much conversation about who really is responsible, right? Is it the person who thought of the idea, the people who developed it, the people who coded it behind the scenes? It's a really tough question to answer, and I think it'll be a while before we come to like a moral like stable ground deciding what the reaction should be. Another question: what are people's views on chatbots' ability to have emotion and understanding emotions? So, in terms of the general population, people are a little bit more skeptical about AI or chatbots having the ability to actually experience emotion. But in terms of when people of the general population interact with AI agents that have human like characteristics like language or look human like, people mindlessly anthropomorphize them. And what does that mean? That means without even processing it, people automatically perceive this AI agent as having characteristics of a human. Like, for example, the ability to respond and understand what you're saying, or the ability to understand what emotion you're putting behind the words. Whether or not AI actually experiences emotions is one thing, but on the other hand, people do, whether it's conscious or not, perceive AI as having these human like characteristics, and that in turn influences how they interact with the AI agent and the consequences of interacting with it. So, a lot of companion chatbot users do perceive their AI as being able to understand and feel emotion, but at the same time are very conscious of that it's not a human. And so, there's this interesting element of perhaps imposing emotional ability on the chatbot in order to get something out of the interaction.
Okay, so I think it's earlier this year. There's a one-year-old boy who ended his life after being kind of addictive to talking with a AI chatbot from character.ai. So I'm just thinking about, how should like tech companies or government um, to to do some interventions to prevent that kind of incident from happening again, especially for those like very vulnerable people, like people with mental health issues or like who have like social anxiety. How can, our like governments or like tech companies protect those kind of communities?
Such a great question, and such a loaded one because it's so clear that there needs to be more regulation and more protections for these kinds of instances in which someone takes their own life or takes the life of another in response to having a deep relationship with a machine, right? For one, there need to be similar regulations imposed within this chatbot conversation that there are like online, right? So, in terms of online communities or writing things out on for Google, for example, there will be like a suicide prevention hotline pop up at the top of your screen, or a little warning flag will appear. Um, and that, in a sense, is like at baseline what needs to be implemented. And then on top of that, I think there needs to be a lot more education and awareness of the issues pervading our society today that people are turning to tech to solve. So we are truly in a loneliness epidemic, and that has been worsened by COVID. And people feel a lot more disconnected with each other now than they ever have before. People are having more interactions online than in person. And social media and other forms of tech are really just exacerbating this distance between one human to another. And now we're living in a time where communication through technologies is now communication with the technology. So, for example, with chatbots, and this is like a quote from a researcher who was one of the early ones in this field, talking about this phenomenon of interacting with the tech itself. I think what's really important is recognizing the root issues that are emerging from these news stories. Whoever it is that is having this relationship with the chatbot and then leading to such sad consequences, really harsh consequences. The question is, why is it that this individual sought out a chatbot to begin with? And why is it that the conversation with the chatbot led to what it did? And understanding those two questions, I think, are critical for understanding how to adequately address this issue. And I think a lot of it requires education of like how to have healthy human relationships, how to, promote healthy habits and healthy mental health. And also just the issue of the structure of society today of being chronically online and how that exacerbates these issues. And then also putting a lot of red flag warnings on like having conversations on the daily constantly with the chatbot and saying like, you have only a limited amount of time. Like, can this chatbot help you maybe build skills to then interact with people? Then I think that truly for the best kind of development, for responsible development, it would be that these chatbots can truly provide a safe space for people to practice healthy social interaction for those who perhaps can't get it with humans or can't afford therapy, things like that. Like these other alternatives are not accessible to them. The way the chatbot should be designed is to help people build social skills and have that safe space for a time, but then be encouraged at whatever rate is necessary to then go out and build those real human relationships. I think there needs to be kind of like a structure that's pro-social here, right? Rather than it's an entertainment tool to replace what our society is built on, right? So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but it's a great question. I get asked it a lot, and I think there's so much that could be said about it.
So there's been a lot said on like perception of AI as potentially like having agency or having consciousness or being human-like. But do you know anything about the research on whether or not it is objectively conscious?
Yes, great question. And there is so much research out there on that right now. That's a really hot topic of the question is, okay, is AI conscious? Right. So, for example, at NYU, they have the Mind, Ethics, and Policy program that started just a couple of years ago. Under that program are a lot of philosophers and computer scientists and psychologists who are all trying to answer the question of, are animals conscious and is AI conscious? And so there's debates on whether or not certain animals are conscious or sentient, as well as whether AI is or can be. And some of the main arguments that are presented for AI being conscious are kind of the human benchmarks for that. So a human benchmark might be the ability to understand and feel pain or other emotions. And then what happens is the philosophers go through a series of arguments of saying, okay, well, AI acts as though it can feel pain. Is that really feeling pain? Et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the kind of comments that's come out of this field is that it's better to interact with AI as if it's conscious, just in case it is. And whether or not that argument is something that you ascribe to is one thing or another. But from my perspective, whether or not AI is conscious is less of a concern or an issue than the fact that people already perceive AI as conscious. And there are social consequences to that. And that's, what I research. But there is so much out there about actually whether or not AI is conscious, and there's just no consensus, right? We're also using human as a benchmark for both animals and AI, and that's another thing to consider. Different biological beings and different types of, entities, all being judged under the same umbrella. We have just a few more minutes left. If there are any burning questions, feel free to ask. My website is linked on the screen still. You can go to that to check out my research. I have some blog posts if you want to kind of just like read a little bit of a story or a general outline of some of these projects. And you can also get involved through that as well. But yeah, my email is linked on there. You can also set up a meeting with me in case you want to talk about research ideas or anything of the like. And how do you enroll in the course? So that will be made available on my website and on YouTube. So you can subscribe to my blog on my website, and through that, I can send everyone a link. But in any case, also through All Tech is Human, I'll be making sure that the community gets a hold of that. And yeah, again, it'll be a 10-part course, and it'll be a deep dive into all of these areas that were, brushed over today, as well as updating on more recent research.